want your soul.
Julia Warren made her way down the Neva River, along with her husband Mike, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectacular firework display held every New Year's Eve in St. Petersburg, the old capital of Russia. Although a relatively short stretch, the vast frozen snow-coated surface of the body of water impressed her. She'd wanted to visit the country ever since she studied its intriguing history back in her college days, but could never find the time to do so until now, already in her late 20s. Nevertheless, she didn't mind. Where better to visit on a honeymoon with the love of her life? The city ahead of them presented a spectacular view in the darkness. Multicolored lights adorned the sky like stars. Streaks of yellow, red, and green shot up into the sky. Then, after a brief delay, the booming sounds erupted. She took out her camera and snapped a few quick shots before sticking her hands back in her pockets to avoid freezing her fingers off. The temperature was well below zero, enough for one to feel their own breath turning into flakes of ice around their lips. The mouth of the river led directly to St. Petersburg, stretching throughout the heart of the city. That meant no map was needed to find their way around it. All they had to do was keep to the path alongside the frozen water. They weren't too far now. Crowds of people were already emerging into view. Her head turned abruptly after hearing someone cry out for help. The yelling, a distinctly male voice, continued for a few moments before it faded into silence. There was nobody out walking beside the river except for herself and Mike, as far as she could see, though it was too dark to rule out the possibility. They exchanged alarmed glances before dashing a few feet back down the river, searching for the owner of the voice. A few were walking around in the streets and alleys, branching off the path, but she felt they were only straying further. The cry then came again, as suspected, from further in the distance. It was so quiet that the people around them dismissed it, but the couple had heard the shrill yell at full volume a few minutes before. They were both certain it was a cause for major concern. The sounds were coming from the river. As they got closer, Julia became sure of it. She peered across the stretch of ice and searched for clues. A dark patch, a watery gap in the ice, caught her attention. The voice then came again, from the exact direction of that gap, and Julia squinted as she furthered up the path. A human hand then reached out from beneath the surface of the ice, and Julia blinked and rubbed her eyes as her heart lurched, questioning what she had just seen. The hand grabbed the rim of the water and tried to pull its body up, but the fingers kept slipping off the edge, just as hints of the scalp would pop up above the surface. The gargled cry then came again. Mike, oh my God, someone's drowning in the water," she stammered with urgency. "What?" Mike turned, and upon spotting the hand reaching out from the ice, he questioned no further. He looked around, where the base of the Litany Bridge met the beach sat a conspicuous orange life ring on a hook, waiting to be used in such a situation. It appeared to be a few hundred yards away. Mike glanced back out into the river, then turned and bolted towards the life ring, circumventing the stone ledges in front of it, trying not to slip on any of the ice. He retrieved it and rushed back, throwing it to his wife. Julia caught it and threw it as far as she could, in the direction of the crack in the ice, a swift course of action which only took about a minute in total. The couple watched anxiously as the ring swirled and spun across the ice, only to gradually slide to a halt, still dozens of yards away from the victim. The gargling cries came again, this time weaker, suffocated. "Shit," cursed Julia. "I didn't throw it far enough. He can't get up onto the ice, so he won't be able to reach it from there." Mike tapped his foot on the ice at the rim of the river. He spat and removed his backpack, slamming it forcefully down on the ice twice. It didn't crack. "Mike, what are you doing?" "Well, don't just stand there. Call the police, or the fire department, or whatever. I'm gonna deal with this myself. Just stay where you are." "No, Mike. No, what the fuck are you thinking? You could die. Just call them." Julie ran to the side of the river to try and drag him back, but he was already too far gone. She uttered a silent prayer that the ice would be thick enough to withstand his weight, and that he would return to her that night a hero, not a drowned blue corpse. Watching him treading on eggshells like an acrobat scaling tightrope, she took out her cell phone and tried to remember what Russia's emergency services number was. 101? 112? That was probably it. Hopefully they could understand English. She kept her eyes fixed on Mike, watching him from the riverbank as she spoke into the receiver. The further he walked, the faster her heart raced. Julia was able to breathe a small sigh of temporary relief after Mike raised a thumbs up from the distance, signaling that he'd reached the life ring. She smiled in response. He bent down and picked it up cautiously, wary of the thinning ice. As the snow disappeared and the ice became transparent like glass, his hubris dawned on him, and the fact that his life was in danger suddenly sunk in properly for the first time. Beads of sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold as he tried not to gaze down into the depths below him, wishing he'd paid more attention to middle school swimming lessons. The water below the ice under his feet was almost black. It seemed to flow away from him, warning him to return. It took him another minute to reach the crack. He looked tiny from the banks. Julia saw him try to squeeze the life ring through the gap in the ice where the man was submerged, but it was too large to fit. He stopped for a few seconds, considering his options. Then he leaned forwards and reached into the hole, where the man's hand was grasping out from. Mike caught the man's arms and pulled him up. As thin as a bone, his upper half seemed to be completely naked, and his skin was almost gray from the effects of the prolonged exposure to the freezing temperatures. Had he been a minute slower, the man surely would have died, Mike thought. The man uttered something in Russian as he tried to clamber out with Mike's help, most likely an exhausted word of thanks. It was then that Mike took note of his odd features by the moonlight. From what Mike could make out, his balding scalp was host to a curtain of dull, shoulder-length gray hair that hung in long strips, plastered to the side of his face. His long, dripping beard was the most prominent feature of his visage. His eyes were closed and there seemed to be a large, bloody cut in his forehead, still running fresh down his cheeks. Mike had no idea how this man was still alive. In fact, there was a creepy atmosphere surrounding the fact that he was still alive. Perhaps he was Chuck Norris's grandfather, or Jesus, he joked to himself. At least a guy that thought he was Jesus, but soon discovered he couldn't walk on water. Anyhow, it looked like he had at least a slim chance of survival. Mike made some gestures of comfort, pulling the struggling man out further until he was just able to support his weight using his elbows on the rim of the hole. Then he stopped trying to get out and waited in that position for a few moments, nodding silently to himself. Mike tugged at his hand in confusion, trying to remind the man that his life was in grave danger after his exposure, and there was no time to waste. He needed to warm up. The man then opened his eyes. Mike's heart jumped. He held still for a while, becoming more terrified by the second. The man's eyes were the green eyes of a viper, glowing, emitting light in the darkness. This light illuminated his face, which was missing patches of skin and had exposed bones in its cheeks. The left side of his head was deformed and caved inwards. The bones of his gums were exposed on the right side of his face, the flesh torn up. The cut in his forehead was now clearly a bullet wound, but his stabbing, hypnotizing eyes were still his worst, most striking features as he began to smile. A wide, crooked grin. The man, the ghoul, had incredible strength, despite his emaciated frame. Mike felt himself being tugged towards and into the hole. He screamed and struggled, but balance wasn't on his side. Julia watched it all in horror, shrieking Mike's name. No way this was happening. She'd anticipated her husband's life was in danger, but she never saw this coming. Snake-like fingers gripped Mike's neck as he writhed like a piglet in the hands of a butcher. His lungs were on fire, as was his broken neck, the last sensation he would ever experience. In his final moments underneath the water, he thought he glimpsed the shadows of women surrounding him, unclothed, frolicking. He could swear he heard them giggling, spitting Russian insults, cackling at his miserable end. How stupid could he have been to volunteer to save someone? The ringing of ambulances' sirens could be heard faintly in the background as Mike's body was hauled over the side of the ice into the freezing depths, accompanied by the melancholy wails of his new widow. 99 years I have been waiting, the man whispered to himself in Russian, the wide, toothy grin still plastered to his face. Exactly 99 years and 1 day. In the newspaper the following day, there was an article. Holiday maker missing in Russia. The body of a British holidaymaker, Michael Warren, has not yet been found after the 28-year-old fell into a crack in the river Neva as a direct result of attempting to walk across the frozen ice, around 2 miles from St. Petersburg on New Year's Eve. Warren was on a honeymoon with his wife Julia when the couple reportedly spotted someone drowning in a gap amidst the ice. Authorities say Warren attempted to rescue the victim, causing himself to fall in the water. The search has been postponed by the Russian authorities due to adverse weather conditions, and will continue as soon as possible. I always feel strange on New Year's Eve, especially when it's the half hour before New Year's Day. Suddenly I feel as though the last half hour of a year or decade actually means something. Unlike when it's the last half hour of a day. This time around was no exception. It was soon to be January 1st, 2015. By 11:30 p.m., my family and I were praying for a good year. We're a religious Catholic family, but we don't take it too seriously like some of those extremist nuts who make us look bad. We finished our prayers at 11:42 p.m., with me leading my family in saying the Apostles' Creed. None of us had it memorized, but I had it in my confirmation book. I received the sacrament of confirmation in February, the previous year. From 11:42 p.m. and on, we eagerly awaited the arrival of 2015. I got out my camera and began to record at 11:51, right as my older sister and my stepfather began playing with my little sister. Much of the video was like that. We threw some of our dolls around as she watched them, causing her to laugh very hard. When it got to 11:58 p.m., my mother got 4 red plastic cups and some wine. She poured a very small amount of wine for my older sister and me, saying, "They're almost old enough to drink." When she gave us our cups filled with a small lick of wine, my mother said, "It's only for toasting." Now, of course, she didn't give any to my little sister. She didn't seem to mind, though. At midnight, we toasted each other as we watched the fireworks go off on the Space Needle on live television. When I sat back down, I realized that I'd have to drink my cup. I didn't know if I should, but I gave it a go anyways. I took one sip and immediately handed it back to my mother. It tasted like shit, though I admitted, at least I tried it. I can't recall if my older sister drank from her cup. I recorded until around 12:05 a.m. From then on, the New Year's joys seemed to die down. I used the computer for another hour before I got a call. I checked who was calling me. It was my friend Daniel. Daniel and I have known each other since August, maybe 2009, I don't know, it's been a while. I can't count how many times I've visited his house within the time we've known each other. In 2014, I began spending the night more often in his house, with the first instance of 2014 being New Year's Day, first day of the year. And he and I are the definition of best friends. I left what I was doing on the computer and went to my room to talk to him. He and I shared the obligatory Happy 2015 greeting before talking about pretty much nothing. Typical talks between 17-year-old friends. We began talking about Spider-Man potentially returning to Marvel, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, how well we thought J.K. Simmons portrayed J. Jonah Jameson, Sam Jackson's portrayal of Nick Fury, and other admittedly nerdy things. Daniel was practically born a Marvel fan, whereas I had only recently become a Marvel fan. We had been talking for a while before I went to close out everything on my computer. We then resumed talking again. The second half of our conversation began with us doing a dumb role play over the phone. Daniel pretended to be Foxy the Pirate Fox, and I pretended to be his roommate. Of course, the way those usually went was that Foxy would act like a sex-hungry creep, and I would be his next victim. We meant nothing by it. It was all just dumb fun. After a while, it was already close to 3 a.m. By then, I was in bed. Daniel was still pretending to be Foxy, though, and I was still pretending to be his scared little roommate. The conversation would have ended with him crooning "Nighty night" in that deep and rough voice he used to pretend to be Foxy. The phone would have hung up, and I would have been well on my way to sleep. My first sleep of the new year. And I would have been much happier if that happened. The weird stuff began when we stopped the roleplay. Daniel said that he felt like he was in a dark bedroom with long curtains. This piqued my curiosity because I'd seen a place like that in a dream I had years ago. I remember exactly what the bedroom looked like. It was only barely lit by whatever light was outside. The light looked like lavender in hue, and I remember seeing the circular bed that sat before the window. The window was draped with very tall satin curtains, and I remember the bedroom had a bit of an uneasy vibe to it. I asked Daniel if he ever saw this, and he said that he did. He began to tell me about a dream he had as a child about being in that very same room, and being accosted by what might have been a mummy or a zombie or something. Not long after this, he and I began to feel what felt like claws digging into the tops of our skulls. They wouldn't relent, and it almost felt like I was about to get brain surgery or something. When those feelings went away, it was replaced with the sight of a face. The face looked at me with wide eyes, and they weren't blinking. I saw a long nose and a horrid grin that accompanied it. It just wouldn't stop staring at me, no matter what I did. I was afraid to shut off my phone, the only light source I had at that ungodly hour. The face then slowly began to rot away. The eyes fell out, the nose grew shorter, and the grin got wider as the flesh melted to reveal ghastly white cheekbones. It continued to melt until nothing was left but a skull. We then heard screaming in both of our ears. At first it sounded like someone exhaling to make it sound like a crowd cheering. But as it traveled further into our ears, it became a death rattle. And once it reached our brains, it became the screams of a man set ablaze. The sheer loudness of those screams made our brains feel like they were going to TV static. The skull receded before charging at us with a wide open jaw. The phone cut itself off at that moment. Neither Daniel nor I hung up, and we couldn't explain it. Daniel's phone was still good on power, and as was mine. I called him back at 3:51 a.m. After that, I felt as though the world was upside down above me, and I was flying lying down. I saw what I thought was a city, and I felt uneasy as the thought of how high I was flying intruded my mind. More faces began to surround us, each of them staring at us like the first one. I tried to talk to Daniel in order for me to stay sane, yet every time I tried to talk, I was interrupted by more ghastly faces. One of them looked like a doll face, with a blonde bob, though the eyes were empty and near the center of the face, and it sported a thin smile wider than its own head. I even remember seeing bared teeth flash before my eyes, as though the person who possessed them absolutely loathed me. The sights continued until after 4 a.m. At that time, I saw myself walking in a cemetery. My head must have been hung very low, because my view of it was directly top down. I continued to walk until I stopped at an open grave. Within it contained a corpse. It was the body of someone I love and care about very much, who I will call Bill Elias Coyers for the sake of his anonymity. I began to cry as I saw Bill lowered into the grave, and I knew I had to describe this to Daniel right as I saw it. Daniel said he saw Satan had conquered the world, replacing everything that wasn't in his likeness with demons. To make matters worse, Satan pinned all of the blame on Daniel, and it seemed as though the damage was irreversible. After that, I reassured Daniel to remain strong and persevere. I told him that no matter what, these things would never happen. I assured him that all of it was only an effort to drive us insane, and that we would get through it. After I said these things, the things we saw finally began to fade away. By 4:40 a.m., everything was back to normal. However, I felt like a changed person. Feelings of fear were replaced with those of solemn anxiety, similar to someone who was just coming back from war. I wondered if we'd developed PTSD, though I couldn't say for sure. The conversation had died down to near silence. Right when it ended, my mind already began to suppress the memories of those nights. I felt as though my mind was saving those memories in order for me to write them down later, and then it would forget them completely. This is the only way I can cope with what I saw in those godforsaken hours. Daniel went to bed shortly after these events, and the conversation officially ended at 4:51 a.m. I, however, didn't feel tired anymore. I wasn't sure I could go to sleep, so I stayed up for the rest of the night watching videos in order to calm myself down. I didn't go to sleep until after 8 a.m., and then I woke up at almost 2. I went to the living room and began to type out the words, "You're reading right now." Recording these events has helped me cope with them. It's allowed me to share what happened to me that night and keep it around for as long as I may desire. As I write this, my memories of the events are slowly dying. Only after I complete and publish this can I finally begin to forget. It's as I said to Daniel after everything happened. Some things in life are going to be forgotten eventually. Some things are things you don't want to forget. And some things are better left forgotten. December 30th, 2009. My name is Jacob Thompson, and for the first 17 years of my life, I lived with my mother, father, and sister. My parents loved each other dearly and boasted 18 years of a strong marriage, and my sister had recently turned 12. The best word to describe our family at that time is happy. And now I'm gonna cut the bullshit. My name is Jacob Thompson, and I'm an orphan. I hope the previous claims didn't make you believe that this is a happy story. All of that happiness was applied in the past tense. It is the past and can never return. The Christmas decorations were in the final stages of the replacement and storage, and the year of 2009 had almost concluded until some fucking asshole broke into our house. I was in my room and awaiting the arrival of New Year's Eve as I slowly drifted off into a deep state of slumber. I assumed my sister Emma had fallen asleep hours ago, but my parents were still up and awake by the time that the two hands of the clock pointed north with a chime. I heard a dreadfully loud shattering of glass, and my eyelids were instantly snapped open with a sudden jolt of fear. What the hell was that? I thought. I'm 17 and wasn't scared to abandon my bed and sleep for an investigation. I walked to my bedroom door and grasped the chilled doorknob. As I attempted to turn the brass fixture and discover what the shattering of glass was, something stopped me. My parents were screaming, and it was undeniably due to horrific fear. My hand released the doorknob with newly developed sweat upon my palm. Now I was scared. Those screams, they didn't just sound right, as they echoed through the hallway and terrorized my sense of hearing. And then I was hearing no, 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 and confirmed my suspicions of disaster. And after that, shut the fuck up. I nearly vomited in fear. It was an unfamiliar voice of aggression, and it was inside my home. I could no longer contain myself in the darkness of my room. I flicked the light switch with a trembling hand and a quivering lip, accompanied by tearful eyes. The tears are still flowing down my cheeks as I write this story more than 1 month later. And then a couple of gunshots. They were louder and more terrifying than the screams. I didn't know what was being shot at, but I could still hear both of my parents screaming in terror. They were alive, but my fear refused to vanquish my body as some motherfucker was threatening my parents with a gun. I don't know why it took so long, but then I remembered the numbers, 911. No, I do remember why it took so long. I had never felt the traumatization of terror to this brutally painful extent, as I was literally frozen with fear. I forced my glaciered legs to retreat from the door, and I grabbed my cell phone. This isn't one of those stories where the phone lines are down or there's coincidentally no signal. I had shitty reception here in the state of Montana, but I managed. I heard someone say 911 on the other end of the line. An extremely minor release of relief was within my emotions. And then more deafening gunshots followed by, "You fucking bitch," and I could only let out a sob to the operator as the trepidation of fear overwhelmed the minuscule relief I just felt. "Hello? What's your emergency?" Another moment of speechless gulping occurred until I could clear my throat and cry. My house has been broken into." And then I gave the operator my address. And then I waited. There were only 2 seconds of chronology until I heard Emma screaming my name. I dropped my only line of communication and opened the door. Emma was there and staring into the depths of the hallway. I progressed and grabbed her shoulders, but it was as if she didn't even notice me. She could only see what I tried so hard not to see. But I looked. Emma and I stared through the tunneling hallway of darkness and into the living room, of which we saw our mother. And beyond her, we saw Larson McCormick. I'm not even bothering to change the names within this story. Google Larson McCormick and see what sick and twisted, fucked up shit comes up. And then, just as Emma attempted to scream for our mother, the redundancy of gunshots occurred. The pistol's barrel was aimed directly at my mother's head and a semi-automatic firing of rounds was released. I don't have an accurate count for the number of shots fired, but it was too fucking many. I saw my mother's head erupt into streams of blood that twisted throughout the air and spiraled through an instant, shedding of her blonde hair. I pulled Emma with so much force that her blouse had been torn and my fingernails were within her flesh. We re-entered my bedroom and collapsed upon the floor. I'd never swore within the presence of my little sister until that moment. I realized that my mother's head had been severed from her body due to an excessive amount of bullets that projected from Larson McCormick's gun. I cried with a dry throat and dampened cheeks, and I knew that the criminal had saw us. 2 unarmed children at the end of the hallway, with worried faces that had witnessed their mother's undeserved execution. Larson McCormick would step through our doorway any moment and shoot the living shit out of both me and my sister. I inspected Emma. Her breaths were wheezing and she began to cough up blood. Her torso revealed a large splotch of blood that had left her body and soaked her blouse. A stray bullet from the murder of my mother had struck my little sister. She couldn't even scream. She only gazed at me with dying eyes and an agape mouth of drooling blood. Why the fuck did I keep her in front of me? I still blame myself for that damn bullet that pierced her pancreas. From my experiences of fictional media, I've been told to apply pressure upon the wound. I did, and I could physically feel the hole within her flesh as the blood gushed from it, and coated my hands like red latex. The hole was about the size of a nickel and was releasing more fluid than what seemed possible. It flowed down her chest and abdomen and pooled upon my carpet. I retained a constant rate of pressure upon my dying sister's wound as she coughed and sputtered words that I wish I understood, but it only sounded like a gargling of blood. I almost forgot about Larson McCormick. But then I heard my father shouting with a deepened voice that boomed in an escalation of decibels. "Fuck you!" Then another shattering of glass in addition to thuds and cracks and other indescribable words that reached my ringing ears as a struggle of which pertained to my father. The profanity continued as I watched Emma with despair and remembered the 911 call. I reached for the phone and the operator was still online. They're trained to never hang up on anyone who was requiring assistance. I need an ambulance. My sister's been shot. And the words rolled off my tongue and spilled from my mouth with a foul and revolting taste of disgusting horror. I never believed that those words would have ever been said. A dispatch was developed, but no one had arrived. I'd estimate that it had only been minutes since the call, but within those minutes my mother had been killed and my sister had been shot. Another 30 seconds and my father would probably be dead too. Then I heard shouting. "Jacob, Emma!" I temporarily abandoned my sister with hopes of rescuing my father from whatever terrorizing dangers he was concealed in. The noises had settled and I approached the living room with hopes of Larson McCormick's termination, and I hoped it'd be as violent and demented as my mother's assassination was. I eventually entered the same room of which held my father and Larson McCormick. My stomach had been turned inside out and my heart was electrically stimulated by a rapid, malignant digestion of fear. I stood inches away from my mother's bloody and decapitated corpse and glared at the murderer who stood within the debris of broken glass and furniture. He held a gun with its barrel pressed against my father's forehead. And then Larson McCormick pulled the trigger. And then I, Jacob Thompson, was converted into an orphan as I watched my father's skull exit through the back of his cranium. I felt the splatters of blood land upon my face and I realized that both of my parents were now deceased due to the brutality of grotesquely vicious violence. The bullet was point blank as it spread my father's forehead and annihilated his brains, removing the upper portion of his head. All that remained was his jaw that presented his lower row of teeth as they dangled from his unsupported neck. I saw the top of his spine and blood was profusely spewing onto the ceiling, instead of being redirected into his brain, of which was now smeared across the room. And then my adrenaline exploded through my pulse with vengeance. I didn't know where the police and paramedics were, but they were somewhere other than within my family's household. I've never participated in a football game, but I tackled Larson McCormick with so much force that I dislocated my shoulder. And I didn't give a fuck about the pain, because I already felt the maximum excruciation of a broken heart. Larson McCormick dropped his gun and collapsed upon the shattered glass as I was mounted on top of his chest, with a fire in my eyes. He had broken into the house through the window, and I grasped the shards of glass with my hands and began to repeatedly stab him. I finished what my father started. I was screaming at him in rage. Even with the dislocated shoulder, I used both arms and both hands to thrust the sharpened fragments of glass into his face. After one particular incision traveled into his mouth and down into his throat, the glass shard broke upon impact and was lodged within his esophagus. Larson McCormick, unfortunately, suffered very little. Another shard of broken glass was lunged into his throat and tore the flesh into a fillet of excessively bleeding skin. That was the death of that fucking asshole who killed my family. But I wasn't done. I treated the cadaver with so much disrespect as I continued to pick up the broken glass and implant it into his head. The blood had squirted from his gashes down to my face, but I took no notice as I treated him like a taxidermist project, and was stuffing the body with glass as I heard the broken fragments crumble within his head, and a pleasurable viewing of a mutilated face lied before me, with jagged edges of glass jutting from its entire surface area. And then finally, the authorities entered the house and its crime scene, and pried my bloody and wounded hands from the body. There were massive pieces of broken glass beneath the flesh of my palms, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel any physical pain. I was entirely overwhelmed by the emotional pain of what I had just endured. I always believed that these things would never happen to me, but my beliefs were massacred with the disproven hypotheses of an enjoyable life, of an enjoyable new year that would only end by natural causes, not by fucking Larson McCormick. The next morning I saw my house and its broken window on the news. The anchor's description wasn't nearly enough detailed as to what I had witnessed. It was simply referred to as shot in the head, and the listening audience was given the largest understatement in history, as far as I can say. My mother and father were dead, and Emma had died in the hospital due to severe blood loss from her puncture as it hit a vital organ. I was fostered into my bachelor uncle's care, and my life had ended as my habits evolved into drugs and alcohol, while I coped with an abusive guardian. There is not enough weed or wine coolers in the world to allow me to live on with my family's death. It began with a broken window and ended with a broken heart. The new year was only a continuation of my life, which was now undesired. I consider suicide daily, and one of these days I might let myself bleed out a little longer than I should, so that I can become reunited with them. Sincerely, Jacob Thompson. At 1:42 a.m. on New Year's Day of 2002, the ABC television station in Waco, Texas, named KXXV, was hacked into, and a creepy broadcast was sent over the airwaves. Not many people know about it, since most people were asleep by 1:42 that morning, and very few of the people still awake were watching KXXV. The few that were, however, reported seeing static run over the unusual talk show that aired at this particular hour. The static lasted for 15 seconds before an image suddenly appeared on screen. It was a distorted image of someone's face, someone with a balding head and a wide smile. The distortion also made their eyes appear large and glassy, and their teeth looked like a rodent's, long and sharp. The image was also accompanied by a startlingly loud, deep rumbling noise. Some say that it resembled actual human speech, though it was too low-pitched to make out. This image, as well as the audio clip played alongside, lasted for about 90 seconds in total. Finally, another 15-second long burst of static came on screen, and the station cut back to the usual talk show. But there have been some strange reports over the years. Rumors say that about a week after the incident occurred, 3 of the 8 people known to have watched it that night were deemed legally insane and sent to the Texas Department of Health Mental Health Services. When asked by interviewers what they saw that night, they would only say, "He's after us all," or "The demon makes things red." When asked what they meant, they would reply that they had heard what the figure was saying quite clearly, even though the other reports, including the ones filed by people who watched the recording and the video, mentioned the rumbling being too deep to understand. These people stated that the voice was saying things like, "suck their souls," and "watching all," though they refused to explain what these things meant. They also reported that the supposed image was actually a video, and that the being's head was shaking violently, with his eyes darting back and forth and his mouth moving with whatever he said. All other reports say that the image was indeed a still one. Following the incident, police made efforts to track down the person who hacked KXXV that fateful New Year's Day, but to no avail. However, it did turn out that someone had a recording of it. Mr. Albert Finster, who was going to a party on New Year's Eve, but decided he wanted to watch the local news and had been recording KXXV that morning, having started recording it at 10:01 p.m. and finished at 8:33 a.m. the next day. Within the recording was the incident. Unfortunately, the VHS was somewhat corrupted, so that the only known footage of the incident is messed up almost beyond recognition. But there is about a 45-second clip of the incident that wasn't messed up or corrupted. It is still partially corrupted though, as a red afterimage continues to haunt the left side of the screen. It started on New Year's Eve in 2012. My wife, my 2 daughters, and I were watching the coverage of the celebrations on TV in the living room. 2013 was only minutes away. I was looking forward to the new year. Things were going very well in my life. I had a good job, was making good money. The kids were doing well in school, and my wife was happy, which was good because then I could finally be happy too. I don't know what exactly happened that night or why, but my entire life fell apart from the moment the colorful ball in Times Square dropped, ushering in the new year. When the ball did drop, we all cheered and I turned and kissed my wife. When she pulled away, she bit my lip hard with her teeth, tearing off a small piece of my flash. A shot of pain ran through my face and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I asked my wife about it later that night in bed, but she acted as if she knew nothing about it. I dismissed the event as if it was nothing and went on with my life. I was determined to make the new year better than the previous year. I wanted to make my life better. Was that too much to ask? I came home from work a couple weeks later to find my youngest daughter using one of my nicest dress shirts to dry off the dog after its bath. Sure, I was upset, but things like that happen sometimes. What am I going to do, right? A few weeks later, I was going to go out to the liquor store, but I couldn't find my car keys. Strangely enough, they were in my older daughter's room, sitting on her nightstand. I went out to the car and was startled to find a long key scratch on the driver's side door. I then went inside to speak to my daughter about it, but she said she didn't do anything to my car, and that she didn't even have any idea how the keys got into her bedroom at all. Now, my daughters are usually truthful. That's how my wife and I taught them to be. But I could tell she was lying to me. She must have been. I mean, really. The evidence was quite clear. Anyway, I grounded her for the weekend. It seemed like a suitable punishment, but that night when I went to see my wife in the kitchen, where she was making dinner, she accidentally brushed a knife off the counter, which landed point down on my foot. I jumped in pain and yanked the knife out of my bloody foot, dropping it on the counter. I looked up at her and was disturbed to see she was still preparing dinner as if nothing had happened. She turned and looked at me, leaning up against the counter, clutching my bloody foot, and said, "Is there something wrong, honey?" I slept that night with a strange, overwhelming sense of fear in my mind. Nothing strange happened for at least a month, until one Sunday morning when I was home alone. The rest of my family was at church, which I had stayed home to finish up some paperwork for my job tomorrow. I got up from my desk and was on my way into the kitchen when I felt like I was being watched. There was an extremely eerie silence in the house. There was gray light streaming through the windows of the house from the cloudy day outside as well. I slowly turned around, with a strange fear of what I would see behind me. What I did see shouldn't have been frightening at all, but for some reason it scared the living shit out of me. Our dog, a fully grown German Shepherd, was sitting straight up at the end of the dark hallway that separated the kitchen from my office. It had a dead, bleeding bird clenched between its jaws. Our dog didn't move an inch. It sat completely still and stared at me with its big dark eyes. I was locked in its gaze for several seconds until a drop of blood from the dead bird hit the floor and the dog immediately turned and pranced away out of my sight. I heard the swinging of the dog door at the back of the house a moment later. I was puzzled for a second, trying to make anything sensible of what just happened. Then I found myself gripped in fear, like something horrible was surrounding me. I closed my eyes, immediately finding myself truly terrified to open them. I don't know how long I stood there for, or what happened while I was, but when I finally opened my eyes, my family was standing at the doorway of the house, looking at the floor beneath my feet. I wondered what the matter was, but when I looked down, I was startled to find the kitchen floor covered in smashed plates, bowls, and drinking glasses. The refrigerator had flung open and food littered the floor around it. "What did you do?" my wife exclaimed. But I just stood there, speechless. Later on, I found myself shopping for all new sets of plates, bowls, and glasses. I also had to buy all new groceries. I tried to explain to my wife that I had no idea how all this had happened. She didn't want to hear it. From that moment on, I felt uncomfortable around everybody in the house. My wife, my kids, even the dog. I hired a therapist who told me all of this was in my head, that it was just stress at work and at home that was causing me to over-exaggerate on little things. But they weren't just little things. It was my entire family. They were out to get me. They wanted to make my life as stressful and as uncomfortable as possible. I tried to keep avoiding the notion, but I couldn't. This idea that my family had turned against me had so much truth to it that it possessed me. It made me sick. I knew what they were up to. It was a hot, humid July night that started to make me think I was going insane. I woke up in the middle of the night, lying in the middle of my bed, staring at the ceiling. A dim light from the hallway lit the bedroom. I continued to stare at the ceiling, suddenly realizing that my wife was not in bed with me. I slowly sat up and was massively confused and afraid by what I saw. Our German Shepherd was sitting at the end of my bed, completely still, just as he had a couple months earlier in the hallway. But it wasn't just him who was staring at me this time. My two daughters stood on either side of him, and my wife stood right behind the dog. And they all stared at me with dark, startling, evil eyes. They didn't move or make a sound. They just stared at me. It was then that I finally looked down at the bed to see that I was covered in hundreds of dead birds. I nearly screamed, looking up to find that my family had disappeared. I looked back down, discovering that the dead birds had also disappeared. I then broke down in what I think was some sort of trauma, holding my head in my hands. It was then that I heard my wife's voice whispering in my ear saying, "You belong to me." I jumped up and looked to where the voice came from, and sure enough, my wife was sitting next to me in bed. I looked at her in a state of pure horror, but she looked at me with concern and said, "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" I stayed home from work the next day, pondering what to do about all this. I was going crazy, and I knew I couldn't live like this. I sat in my dark office all day, wondering what I was going to do. After hours and hours, I finally decided. It was about 8 o'clock at night. My family was getting ready for bed, and I was downstairs in the kitchen. I took out the biggest, sharpest knife I could find, and I headed upstairs to where everybody was. I was gonna end this. I first marched into my bedroom where my wife was lying in bed reading a magazine. And without any hesitation, I slit her throat with a knife. The gurgling sounds of her drowning in her own blood brought pleasant relief to my mind, but I wasn't done yet. I then walked into my older daughter's room where she was playing with our dog. I pushed her away and stabbed the dog several times in its chest, and the whimpering sounds of it dying gave me a strange sense of freedom. My daughter started screaming as the pool of blood crept towards her, and my younger daughter then ran into the room, and upon seeing the sight, she began to scream too. I then silenced both of their screams and exited the room with a knife far bloodier than it had been moments prior. I walked out into the hallway and savored the sweet silence in the house. I dropped the knife and closed my eyes. I was free. Free. When I opened my eyes, though, all my relief went away. I looked at the hallway wall in horror. On it, a pentagram was drawn in blood. Underneath the pentagram were the words also written in blood. "You belong to me." I stood there staring at those words, paralyzed by the most pure form of terror. And then I passed out. I woke up in what I believe is a mental hospital. I'm sitting in a padded cell with a straitjacket on now. They keep telling me that I killed my family, and that they were good people, and that they didn't deserve what happened to them, and that they never did anything to me, and that I was crazy. But I had to do it. Don't you understand? Can you hear me? I had to. I would still be living in a hell right now if I didn't do it. Ended it. Whether I told myself to do it or something else did, it was the right thing to do. And I know that in my bones. But none of that matters now, of course. What's done is done. The only thing that keeps running through my mind are the echoes. You belong to me. On January 11th, 2000, the Chicago Police Department was investigating the death of 41-year-old Richard Cooley. The deceased was found in his 2-room apartment in the New City area, hung by a noose from a ceiling fan. The police, while investigating the case, noted unusual scribbles on the walls. As two inspectors examined the body, one of them stated in near certainty that this was a suicide, having needed only an initial glance to reach this conclusion. The door was locked, requiring a locksmith to open it for investigators, and none of the windows showed any signs of tampering, as they had been taped shut from the inside. The victim's apartment was a messy sight, papers with seemingly mindless doodles strewn everywhere. A few houseplants that looked to have not been tended to in months, food wrappers and clothes cluttering the floor and all available surfaces. The investigators placed the time of death at around 2 days prior. Friends of the deceased had made plans involving him for New Year's Eve, which he did not attend to for any stated reason. This was the last contact these friends had with the deceased. When one of these friends grew concerned after several days and went to the apartment to investigate, they found the door locked and the deceased unresponsive. They found this suspicious, obviously, as they had no explanation for why the deceased would suddenly leave. Authorities were alerted when a strange smell was then noticed. The writing on the walls appeared to be meaningless, just a seemingly random assortment of letters and an odd number here and there. One investigator pointed out that the spaces and seemingly strategic placement of vowels indicated that these were supposed to be words, but not any language they were familiar with. Further investigation showed these words to not be of any known language at all. One investigator noticed something very strange, though. The deceased's palms were covered in dried blood. Further investigation determined this to be the deceased's own blood, although no scars or wounds were seen anywhere on the body. Dried blood was also found caked on the soles of the deceased's shoes, which he was wearing at the time, although no blood was found anywhere on the floor. Upon further investigation, a small number of the writings on the walls seemed to be written in blood, also that of the deceased according to the laboratory. The specific precinct which primarily handled the case, and will not be revealed here, saw an unusually high suicide rate among its officers and investigators since the case was dropped. No connection to the case itself has been drawn to this ever. The circumstances of these suicides have all been realistic and unconnected. All of the officers individually came to take their own lives, as if completely by coincidence. However, what truly marked this case as unusual for the detectives was simply that the blood used for the writing on the walls was still fresh when the investigators found it, indicating it had been left there very recently. As previously stated, there was no apparent method by which any outside persons could have done this, and the only available person had died 2 days prior. To this day, the investigators have no explanation as to what chain of events could have led to those circumstances, but do have an idea it had something to do with New Year's Eve.